you asked me to make a herbicide resistant, I would tell you keep spraying the same weed with the same herbicide every year. That's, I suppose, really how resistance occurs. So to prevent resistance, we do the opposite to that. So, it's alternating herbicides.
The glorious weather over the past few days is welcomed by farmers and also growing crops. All crops are moving through growth stages quickly, and many jobs are starting to stack up on farms. For tillage crops, it's either an all-in or not at all in terms of management. Farmers cannot afford to do a half or mediocre job, as a poor job will impact yield, and profitability only comes when yields are high. Weed control is one such job, and this must be achieved to a 98% or more control of weeds, not only for the crop in question, but also to reduce the seed bank in the long term. You are listening to the latest episode of Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm joined by Ciaran Collins, Shay Phelan, both tillage specialists in Teagasc, and also Vijaya Bhaskar, a weeds researcher in Teagasc, to chat about weed control options in spring crops. Ciaran, I want to come to you first. Spring barley is moving through the growth stages quite quickly, but are there many of the later sown crops ready for weed control at the moment?
Just coming on it, Michael, I suppose we have kind of a three-stage sowing this year. We had some very early ones there in the end of February, early March, and then we had some around Easter, and I suppose the majority that were sown then, in April, and I presume these are the ones we're talking about now, because the other two would have their weeds controlled at this stage. So a lot of those crops are coming to the 4 or 5 leaf stage at this stage of the crop, and we are seeing a nice spread of weeds in these. So these are either being sprayed, or a lot of them are ready to be sprayed there at the moment, Michael.
Okay, and I just see locally there's a good few farmers out there after rolling crops only recently, maybe over the last couple of days. What sort of consideration should be taken into account between rolling and maybe applying a weed herbicide?
Yeah, I suppose we just have to bear in mind that, when we're applying a herbicide to a weed, we're trying to apply the herbicide, or the best effect will become from spraying an actively growing weed. So if a weed has been rolled or damaged by wheel tracks or that, you certainly need that to recover, so ideally you'd be spraying the weeds and possibly rolling afterwards. But if it's rolled, you just need to give it enough time to recover. Fortunately enough, there's good growth at the moment, so possibly a week or 10 days and they should be ready for spraying then, I would think.
Okay, and what would be regarded, Ciaran, as a standard weed control strategy in spring barley?
Look, I suppose at this stage, really the basics are a sulfonylurea would be normally the base, or the central part of any good herbicide program at this stage. And then you're talking about adding a suitable mixer product. So it's important to use 2 actives for a start, because that certainly reduces the resistance risk. And that partner to the sulfonylurea, then I suppose you're always kind of looking at it in terms of targeting what weeds are in the field. So maybe that might be chickweed, that might be speedwells or fumitories, groundsels, typical weeds that you're going to see. So, a good broad spectrum partner is what would be advised, really. And then the rates, I suppose, would be the other thing, just to make sure that that the rates of the herbicide used are appropriate to the weed size in the field. So, there is scope when you're spraying small, actively growing weeds to reduce rates, but just to make sure that the rate is high enough to control the weed that you're after.
So when you're talking about, Ciaran, sulfonylurea, are you talking about Ali Max, Cameo Max, that kind of thing? And when you're talking about a mixer, are you talking about the likes of maybe a Duplicin or a Galaxy or something like that? Am I on the right?
Yeah, 100%, Michael. So the sulfonylureas, as you say, they would be the typical ones that you mentioned there. And then we're very fortunate, we do have a good range of products with a good mix of actives, so you mentioned Galaxy there, you have the Arlex based ones, very good as well. And you still have the old hormone types, which like CMPP, which is still used in places. So, as I say, it's just really picking the mix that's appropriate to the weeds that you kind of have in the field, really.
Okay, and what about the inclusion of wild oats in that scenario? Can you put it in together, put it all into one big mix, or do you need to sequence that out a bit?
Yeah, you can certainly. I suppose, look, you can use the wild oat herbicide, which is generally going to be axial, I suppose, or to just use that example, that can be mixed with the sulfonylurea and a partner product, not a hormone, so you're avoiding the hormones in that scenario. But certainly like the Galaxies, Pixaros, Zypers, any of those. The only consideration there is that the rate must be at a minimum of 0.6 of a litre per hectare. That's the only stipulation there, really.
Okay, and would you have any issue or worry about the wild oats if they're not up at the moment?
Again, I suppose, look, when we sow a seed, they're generally all sown at the same depth. Obviously, that's not the case for wild oats. So some will come at the same depth as the barley that you planted, but some will come from shallower. But I suppose the worry that you raised there is some coming from deeper, So certainly you'd always, like, if you had your bar, whatever growth stage your barley would be at, sometimes the wild oats, the later ones, can be a growth stage or two behind. So just leaving that little bit of time. I think really once you get to the 4 to 5 leaf stage of the barley crop, you're generally safe enough with wild oats at that stage. The only place that you might consider delaying a little bit later is where you have maybe something like canary grass, which can be a little bit slower in establishing sometimes. But then you have to balance that with coverage. We really, really need good coverage. So the longer you delay, you're reducing coverage, and that's obviously going to, impact on control.
And when you mean coverage, that's the herbicide being able to penetrate through the crop all the way down to the weed at the base of the crop, is that it?
Yeah, absolutely. Once the crop starts to tiller and cover the ground, you're dealing with a narrow leaf weed, and it's particularly with canary grass, I suppose, and wild oats, and that's a difficult target to hit. So you're just trying to find that sweet spot there, which I think is probably maybe 4 to 5 leaf stage at least of the barley, but before it starts to tiller out, when you start waiting until fungicide timing, you have a lot of cover there and your control won't be as good.
Okay. Shay, just to bring you in, and Ciaran mentioned a little bit up there about herbicides and matching the herbicides to the different weeds that you have in the field. Is it a case that some of the herbicides are just really unable to control the weeds, whereas maybe a weed may become resistant to a different herbicide, or maybe resistant to that herbicide? How would you describe that difference?
Yeah, you're right, Michael. I mean, not every product is going to control every weed. And I suppose that's the key point in what Ciaran was saying there about mixing and matching and picking products that are suitable for whatever scenario you happen to be in. If you take something like, say, for example, Cameo Max as an example, right? So Cameo Max as a sulfonylurea has a very broad spectrum range of weeds that it controls, but it doesn't control everything. So if you take something like cleavers, for example, it never controlled cleavers or was never designed to control cleavers. So if you put out Cameo Max into a field and you saw cleavers afterwards, you'd say, yeah, look, that's what we expected. You're not going to get control of it. But I suppose from the point of view of that's why you would put in a mixture product, something like a hurler type product or the old Starin, as we used to know years and years ago. And the Feroxaport does control cleavers. So that's why you would put in that to control that. But I suppose if you move it on, then you're asking what's the difference between that and then resistance, or how will we know the difference? We know from when the products were launched that that's what they were designed to control. So we knew that Cameo wasn't designed to control cleavers, whereas Hurler is. But if you take something like poppies or chickweed, when Cameo Max was designed first, it was designed to control chickweed. But I suppose over time, probably through misuse and overuse and maybe reducing rates, what we're finding now, or we have found, is that chickweed now is not being controlled by Cameo Max. So in that case, we have developed resistance to that weed towards Cameo Max by the misuse or overuse, whatever you want to call it, of that product over a long number of years. So that's the difference really, Michael, in terms of why aren't we getting control of one weed when we used to get control of another weed? And that's the difference really between them.
And Shay, particularly in a field, when a farmer applies a herbicide and the weeds weren't controlled, how does the farmer know that that's resistance or that's tolerance, I suppose, that was already there?
Well, the first thing they should look at is the label of the herbicide that's used. So for starters, if the product or the weed that you're looking at is not on that list of control weeds, then you know that herbicide was never really designed to control that weed in the first place. However, like I say, if it's a poppy or a chickweed and you've looked at the Cameo Max label, it actually suggests on the label that it will control those weeds. All right. So that's the first port of call. The other thing you will notice then is that the weed is continually growing. It's not stopping growing. Cameo Max or those sulfonylurea type products, they kind of bonsai the weed and stop them from growing over time. But if they're resistant, they will continue to grow and they continue to get bigger and throw flowers at the end of their cycle. So that's how you'll know that the product, even though it was supposed to control it, isn't now controlling it, and then that shows you that it's resistant.
And I suppose maybe there's another element to it as well, as in, I mean, with the best will in the world for lots of farmers, things go wrong. Rates go wrong, temperature is wrong, maybe the amount of product that went in the tank is wrong. There's a few different pieces that it mightn't have worked terribly well in the first place. But would you agree that there's maybe a scenario if you see on a field some weeds that are controlled extremely well, sitting beside weeds that haven't been controlled at all is probably a reasonable...
Exactly. It's another key sign that not every weed is going to be resistant at the same time. So there will be populations within the field quite often that are controlled. And quite often it's very difficult to make distinctions between, sometimes if something goes wrong in the tank or something goes wrong, there'll be regular patterns in the field. Whereas where you have a resistant plants, they can exist side by side in the same tramline or in the same spray pass. So you can have weeds that are controlled, similar weeds that are controlled, or the same species of weed that's controlled side by side, the same species that's not controlled. And that's real definitive evidence that you have resistance.
Okay. And Shay, you're right there walking a good few fields across the country. What's the most common weeds that you're seeing that are resistant out there?
Chickweed is probably the big one, Michael. Up our neck of the woods, there's probably a good bit of poppy as well that's starting to become resistant. Down in the south of the country, I think there's probably a bit more corn marigold that's well flagged at this stage. That's still a problem out there. So they're probably the three most common ones that I'm seeing at the moment in terms of broadleaf weeds. Obviously the grass weeds, then there's issues there with the likes of Italian ryegrass and blackgrass as well. So there are issues as well out there. Okay,
Vijay, I want to bring you in here at this point. Vijay, you're researching weeds now in Oak Park, and you're looking at a lot of resistance developing or resistance testing, I suppose, of these weeds. In terms of the herbicide resistance that you're carrying out some of the broadleaf weeds, have you confirmed any cases as yet?
So Michael, as with the grass weed resistance in broadleaf weeds is also on the rise. Since ALS herbicide forms the basis for most broadleaf weed control program. So to answer your question, yes, we have started a screening for broadleaf weed resistance. We have located 2 cases of poppy from Meath and Kildare, and they were resistant to all ALS SU type herbicides, the likes of Ali and Cameo Max. We also found a low level of resistance to another ALS chemistry, fluorosilum, which is used in which is included in Boxer or Broadway Star, and the population were also resistant to hormone type herbicide 2,4-D.
And Vijay, how resistant are these weeds? I mean, is it just the fact that if you put a full rate on, it won't control it terribly well, or are they more resistant than that?
Michael, they were extremely resistant. So following our dose response experiment, 100% of the plants survived 8 times the field rate, which is well above the legal limit for farmer use of all ALS SU herbicides. And this resistance was due to target site mutation. So I suppose poppy with a long seed bank, it is unlikely that an ALS type only herbicide will ever be active again to control poppy in those problem fields. And to make worse, one of the resistant poppy form also has ACKs and ALS resistant blackgrass.
So it's as good as pouring water on them. They're just really not ALS chemistry or amios or Ali cameos, those kind of ones. They're really just not going to control those cases that you have confirmed.
No. The ALS type herbicide won't have any control. But what we have found is that as products like Zypar, which has fluorosilum and new chemistry Arilex, they were highly effective.
Okay, so there's still something in the army there. In terms of the grass weed control, Vijay, and I know you've done a lot of testing on grass weeds in terms of resistance. How worried should growers be around spring crops, or is it a bit less than winter crops?
Spring wild oats, I suppose, is a major problem in spring cereal and non-cereal break crops with the likes of oilseed rape, beans, and so on. And we have found 3 types of resistant patterns with the wild oats so far. We have a population that were resistant across all ACKs actives with the likes of Axial used in wheat and barley, graminicides, Falcon or Stratus used in non-cereal break crops. And out of the total population we tested, 35% were cross-resistant to all ACKs actives. And we also have wild oat field population resistant to only axial and falcon, and we have wild oat population resistant to falcon only. So we haven't detected any resistance to ALS specifica and Broadway star, but they can be used only in winter wheat. I suppose, like Ciaran and Shay mentioned, the other problem weed is canary grass, which is particularly difficult to control in a continuous spring crop. And I suppose axial at full label rate would be effective in controlling a susceptible population of both wild oats and canary grass. Where large population of canary grass is present, I suppose a maximum rate is needed.
So it's often the case, Vijay, where and what you're saying there is that there's a good bit that there is a note that there's certainly wild oats that are resistant out there. That's what is that about 20% of the population? Am I correct in remembering that, give or take, of what you've tested?
It's around 20 to 25% population were resistant.
Okay, so I suppose the thing about it is that if a farmer knows that it's resistant in the likes of spring barley, but there's now let's just say there's beans in that field this year. Is it a case that the farmer can just go in and use a graminicide, the likes of Falcon or one of those, and he'll be okay? Or is there more to be considered there?
So yeah, I think it is necessary to assess the control in break crop and use an appropriate graminicide, like you mentioned, the Falcons and Status Ultra, and they should go with the full label rate so that they can control the susceptible population of either spring wild oats or canary grass.
But you're saying there's a little bit of cross resistance between axial and some of those graminicides. Is there any other choices in there that might help?
Where we found the resistant to axial and falcon, the Status Ultra is still effective, and it's not like because the weed has developed resistance to one herbicide, it doesn't mean that it will be resistant across all the herbicides. So that's why resistant testing is very critical. But what we found with population like the ones that are resistant to axial and falcon, still Status Ultra was effective. And we can also go with the ALS herbicide, but only in winter wheat.
Okay, so the go-to one if you have problems in selected spring barley is Status Ultra. That's the go-to product in terms of controlling those wild oats in the likes of beans.
Exactly.
Okay, so when we talk then about Vijay, and a final question to you, just in terms of the trying to figure out if the population on a farmer's field is actually herbicide resistant. Are we testing any of those? Are we continuing to test those?
Michael, as you might know, Oak Park offers a free resistant testing service to test all suspect grass and broadleaf weeds. But particularly, we ask growers to pay attention to fields with the likes of blackgrass. All should be considered as suspect. Herbicide resistant suspect. And the fields with the Italian ryegrass, all must be considered as a suspect. And also the fields with the wild oats and bromes or even annual meadowgrass and the likes of broadleaf weeds like Shay and Ciaran mentioned, chickweed, poppies, corn marigold. We will be able to test all the populations.
Okay, you're in the market to test everything. Whatever's out there, you'll have a go
exactly. At it. And growers or advisors who wants to submit the sample, they just need to follow 3 simple steps. So they have to collect the ripe seed and the seeds that easily fall off the panicle for grass weeds. And when it comes to broadleaf weeds, we need ripe seed heads. And then they need to send us a sufficient quantity, so we will be able to test every weed with all label herbicides that have activity on that weed. And the most important step is to fill out the testing form with as much as information so that we can understand the reasons for any variation in sensitivity. And even if the growers want us to collect the sample, just contact us, and we will be able to sample their field population.
And just, I suppose, to temper people's expectations, this is not a quick process. It's a plant that needs to be grown, and then there's spraying to be done afterwards and counting to be done afterwards. How long would it take, give or take, for a farmer to get a result back?
Michael, most of the grass weed have a dormancy period. So as soon as the sample come in, we won't be testing the sample straight away. So we will the dormancy breaking itself is going to take 4 to 7 weeks at least. And then to test because we at the moment we use a glasshouse seed testing. So the spraying will be done at 2 to 3 leaf stage, and the assessment will be done around 35 days after spraying. So roughly we are talking about 3 to 4 months minimum to know the status of the population.
Okay, depending on the level of samples
Yeah,
you get in.
but what we are trying to do is that we are developing a petri dish assay, so it cannot be tested for all the weeds and all the herbicide type, but it is a quick test, and we can get the result within 14 days. So which will help farmers immensely, and we are working on it, and we are going to pilot it with this year's sample.
Okay, geez, that's great news if we get something back that fast. Ciaran, can I bring you back in there just in terms of the resistance on some of the on farms? I know it's on some farms, but maybe not all farms. From a farmer using herbicides, from the perspective of kind of best use, what's your advice in terms of trying to prevent that resistance building up over time?
Michael, I'm going to answer the question in a different way to the way you asked it. If you ask me to make a herbicide resistant, I would tell you keep spraying the same weed with the same herbicide every year. That's, I suppose, really how resistance occurs. So to prevent resistance, we do the opposite to that. So, it's alternating herbicides. And I suppose then to alternate herbicides, we really need to alternate crops. So crop rotation is probably the best real way of preventing resistance, because then, like Vijay said when he was talking about wild oats, you have maybe limited options in spring barley, and then you switch to maybe, beans or beet or something like that, and you have you're using a different herbicide group. So I think it's really crop rotation is probably the key one, but certainly it's all around alternating herbicides and not relying on the same herbicide every year to control the weed you're after,
But I suppose the thing I suppose that probably comes back to me a little bit is that maybe there's a little bit of more knowledge needed, perhaps. We talked about Ali Max, we talked about Cameo Max. I think Broadway Star has also been brought up in the conversation. Pacifica might have been brought up. There's Pre-Site. There's a whole heap of various different chemicals with lots of different names. From a farmer's point of view, rotating those chemistries, is that good enough, or is there more knowledge needed to know what's the core chemistry behind them?
Well, yeah, I suppose like all those products you mentioned are from the same family, so they're not really going to help prevent resistance. So when I say alternating herbicides, I mean alternating herbicide families, different groups of chemicals. So again, that's why I say that, Cameo Max or Pre-Site Max or Harmony, they're all sulfonylureas. So like we said earlier, it's that mixing partner so that you have an alternative method of control there. And then, the changing the cropping, which will bring you into maybe different other herbicide groups. I think that's really the key to it. It's use different herbicide groups all the time.
Okay, and don't rely completely on your agronomist to know all that, because they're working on an awful lot of crops. So it's I think I heard it nicely said by a researcher who is been in the game for an awful long time. You have to own your own weeds because you're the one who created them. I always think that's a pretty good one. Shay, I'm going to leave the final word with you. Shay, just in terms of these late planted spring barley crops, I think everything needs to go perfect. It needs to be almost like a Cinderella kind of year for a lot of those crops to achieve a very high yield and hence some sort of a margin. Is there any scope, as we're talking about weed control, is there any scope to reduce the costs of weed control on the farm? And if not, is there somewhere else that people should be targeting instead?
It's a conundrum for most people, Michael, that you try to grow a crop as best you possibly can, and weed control is central to that. In terms of reducing costs, look, we've mentioned already, or Ciaran has mentioned already, in terms of the capacity to where you can actually reduce rates for the likes of sulfonylureas if you have small growing weeds. I suppose again the key thing is to look at the spectrum that you're dealing with. So to me, wild oats is non-negotiable. They're going to take a lot of yield potentially from the crop if there's wild oats in the field. So that would be my number one concern. If you have a field that has a lot of wild oats, I think you have to control them. You don't have a choice, because they're not just a weed for this year, they're a weed for every year. So that would be my first port of call. Other weeds, say like cleavers, something similar. If you have a field that's bad with cleavers, they're very good at robbing yield from crop and pulling down the crop close to harvest. And especially on those late sowing crops, they're going to be late harvested, so you need them standing when you come to harvest them. So cleavers would be another one that I would say is non-negotiable. But some weeds, like maybe something like groundsel, even poppies, although they might look poor in the crop, they're not terribly yield robbing. So I suppose if you wanted to be really tight about it and cut costs, some of those lower yield robbing weeds would be probably ones that I wouldn't be as concerned about. That said, something like charlock or something like that, which will grow very, very quickly, would be something that I would try and control. But therein is the issue that if you're going after one of those weeds, you're probably going to have to end up covering a lot of them anyway with the same products. So
timing and weed size is probably the key issue there, is it?
Yeah. So in terms of cutting out herbicides, I don't think there's really much scope. It's about getting in early on those really small cut leadings, the first 2 leaves, control them at that stage. You can reduce your rates, mix in a mixture product, and there are plenty of generics out there that are at lower value or lower cost as well. So I would say looking at those rather than taking out or not putting on a herbicide is the way I would go.
Okay. Shay, thank you very much for your time, and also to Ciaran and Vijay. I am really delighted you could join us for this. It's certainly been a good in-depth look at some of the weed control issues in spring cereals, I suppose, more so than anything else, and some of the resistance issues. And I suppose just to reiterate Vijay's point there for anybody, that if you have weeds that you're finding very difficult to control, you're better to have the knowledge as regards the herbicide resistance of that weed, so you can actually put together strategies in the future. So do keep an eye on them and gather up some samples and send them in here to Vijay in Oak Park. Gentlemen, thanks very much for your time again.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this week. And my thanks to Shay, Ciaran and Vijay for joining me on the show. Finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.